Hospital chaplains learn very quickly that they are not doctors. And patients, if they want to see the chaplain at all, rarely want to talk about their diagnosis, their prognosis, or any other kind of osis you can think about. My aha moment came during my very first visit as a chaplain. I looked at the chart hanging there outside of the room, and it said, kidney biopsy, benign. Oh, this is good. What a great first visit. I assumed I was being called to a joyous celebration, maybe to offer a prayer of thanks, kind of strutted in, a little chaplain swagger. But that wasn't the case at all. Cindy was the young woman with the kidney in question. And she quickly and tearfully shared with me that she was also the mother of a child with special needs. Wasn't in the chart. She shared with me that she harbored anger in her heart towards God for the challenges that her child faced. And as she poured out her heart to me, she questioned whether or not that if this health scare had been sent by God as punishment for the anger she had in her heart. As she talked, I furiously fumbled through the chart. Perhaps I had misread the diagnosis, but I hadn't. This was an issue of the soul, not of the physical body. One that was not documented in the medical record. And so that day, first patient, first visit, I learned a big lesson. By the time I met Miss Elsie there on the 9th floor of the Reynolds Tower over at Baptist Hospital, I had pretty much stopped looking at the doctor's notes altogether, because I knew that that was not why I was called. Miss Elsie was short and stout. When she spoke to me, she spoke not of her leukemia, but rather fondly of her husband who had died a few years back. He died while they were watching television. She was dozing on the sofa at the time, and she didn't realize he was gone until the house curled up in an eerie silence, and she saw him slumped over on the floor. She would come for treatments, seemingly endless and unquestionably brutal cycles. 3 weeks in the hospital, 21 days of treatment, and then 7 days home. 21 days in the hospital, 7 days home. Over and over again. Listening to her story and remembering it now brings to mind the story of another widow, the persistent widow in Jesus' parable of the unjust judge. It's a story that's found in Luke chapter 18, and it will serve as our primary text today as we continue our summer sermon series. We're winding down just 3 more weeks of this series entitled Stories Jesus Told. Let's read the passage together. Luke chapter 18, verses 1 to 8. Luke 18, 1 to 8. Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. So right there we know, here's the purpose of the parable. He said, in a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, grant me justice against my adversary. For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so that she won't eventually come and attack me. And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones, who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith like this on the earth? Get up, the judge's wife carps. She's back again. Who? The judge mumbles, barely opening his mouth. That widow, I don't know her name, just some dead man's wife. Her again? That woman will raise the dead with all that racket. I guess I better go see what she wants. although I really already know. If I don't go down there, none of us will get any sleep around this neighborhood tonight. She was a widow. We don't know her name. You usually did not know a widow's name in that culture. Faceless victims of society. Without husbands to provide for them in a male-dominated world, widows were literally at the mercy of the community for charity, for benevolence, back then in the first century. They were among the most vulnerable, the most at risk in such a society, without resources, without any kind of structured support like our social security system. Nameless, faceless. Who was that? I don't know, just some widow. Oh. It never ceases to amaze me. You ask a widow, you ask Miss Elsie when she bought her first home, and she'll say something like, I think it was 1972. Yeah, 72. Or was it 73? I can't be sure. But you ask her how long it's been since her husband died, and she'll tell you it's been exactly 3 years and 7 months tomorrow. She was a widow. We don't know her name. But we do know a few things. We know, for example, she was in some kind of trouble. What was it? Was her home about to be foreclosed on? Was her son in some kind of trouble with the law? It's hard raising a son without a father. Now and back then. She's in trouble, and she's come to the judge for help, but he's of no help. You see, this judge is uninterested in her plight. That's at best. And at worst, he is corrupt. Luke describes him as a judge who feared neither God nor regarded man. But she's desperate. What can she do? And so she presses her case, even though she knows the judge's reputation. She presses her case not because she believes in the system or because the judge is fair, because he's not. She presses her case because that's what widows have to do, because no one else was there to do it for them. She presses her case because she believes in it, and because she has a tireless faith that will not be thwarted. No matter how long or how hard, she will not be denied. Besides, she is used to hearing no. By including this story in his gospel, Luke is driving home a point to his church, which, like the widow, is also frustrated because things had not turned out according to plan. Jesus had taught them to pray. He had taught them to pray, "Thy kingdom come." But it hadn't. Oh, it wasn't because they hadn't prayed. They had prayed, that was the problem. They prayed, but still the kingdom had not come. The disciples, every time they gathered to pray, prayed, "Lord, thy kingdom come." They prayed it every time they gathered for communion. They remembered the promise he made to them. "The next time I eat this bread with you and drink this cup with you, it will be in the kingdom." But he hadn't come. And so now a couple of generations have passed, and all of these generations have prayed, "Thy kingdom come," praying, waiting, silence. These are Luke's readers. These are the first readers of this gospel, those who are praying and waiting and hearing crickets. And to add insult to injury, the little community of followers were now experiencing persecution and hardship, and some of them were beginning to lose heart. Time alone can be a formidable and impressive enemy of faith. I know that from my own experience. But you add to it suffering and hardship, and faith can wither in the heart. These themes appear to be important to Luke, as he has already addressed them when he included the parable of a friend at midnight in his gospel. This parable appears earlier in the book of Luke, and it can certainly be viewed as a companion to the one of the persistent widow and the unjust judge. I want to take a little side trip, and I want to go back to Luke, the 11th chapter with you this morning. Now, a little background. We're all familiar with the Lord's Prayer, right? When we think of it and we recite it, we're taking it out of the Gospel of Matthew. But it's also here in the Gospel of Luke. It's a shorter version, so if you're in a hurry, it's a good one to remember. But it's there. Unlike Matthew, who follows his prayer with an exhortation that people ought to forgive one another, Luke instead follows the prayer with the parable in which Jesus teaches the petitioner, the one who's praying, to be persistent. Let's read this, Luke chapter 11, verses 1 to 10. Luke 11, 1 to 10. One day Jesus was praying in a certain place. When he finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray just as John taught his disciples." He said to them, "When you pray, say this: Father, hallowed be thy name. Your kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread. Forgive us our sins, for we also forgive everyone who sins against us. And lead us not into temptation." Then Jesus said to them, "Suppose you have a friend, and you go to him at midnight and say, 'Friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread. Another friend of mine on a journey has come to me, and I have no food to offer him.' And suppose the one inside answers, 'Don't bother me. The door is already locked, and my children and I are in bed. I can't get up and give you anything.' I tell you, even though he will not get up and give you the bread because of friendship, yet because of your shameless audacity, he will surely get up and give you as much as you need. So I say to you, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened. For everyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds. And to the one who knocks, the door will be opened." A traveler arrives at midnight. Perhaps to avoid the heat of the day, maybe he had been delayed. He's tired and hungry, and he looks to his host for hospitality. But by coming at such an unusual hour, he has placed his host in a predicament. He either must refuse the hospitality because he's out of bread, or he has to go to his neighbor's house to ask for a few loaves. It's a bit of a conundrum. If he refuses to feed his traveler, he would break the established norm of hospitality and bring shame upon himself, his household, and perhaps the entire village. But if he goes to his neighbor at midnight and bangs on the door, he will incur his displeasure, if not wrath and anger. We should know that houses in Israel usually only had one door. It was left open during the day for ventilation, but at night when the sun set, the head of the family would close the door and slide a wooden bar on both door and wall to keep out intruders. They would spread mats out and use them as beds. The family would line up in a row. So in such circumstances, it's dark. Everyone's lined up in front of the door. It's hard to get up and make a raid on the pantry. Nevertheless, the host decides that annoying a neighbor is a lesser crime than refusing hospitality, and he heads next door. And he knocks on the door with shameless persistence. "Friend, I need 3 loaves of bread." Why 3? Because that was the typical size of a meal back in those days. A good portion for one person. He knocks with shameless persistence. And what's the response? "Come on, man. Don't bother me. I'm here with my kids. We're sleeping." The neighbor expresses unwillingness, not inability. He just doesn't want to get up. But returning home empty-handed was not an option for this host. So he keeps on knocking, and he keeps on asking, until the neighbor got up, lit the lamp, removed the wooden bar, opened the door, and gave him the bread. We understand that the neighbor did not do this because of friendship. It says right in the text. But he did it because of the host's shameless audacity, or his persistence. And it's that word, persistence, that's the key word in the conclusion of the parable. George Mueller was persistent. When George Mueller was a young convert, he began praying daily for 5 friends to come to know Jesus as Savior. 2 of his friends became Christians right away. A third about 10 years later. But the 4th waited until shortly before Mueller's death in response to Mueller's last sermon. And the 5th man, he was converted within a year of Mueller's funeral. George Mueller had been praying for him for more than 60 years. That's persistence. Jesus teaches in these 2 parables that we may go boldly to God in praying, knowing that he will answer. If a neighbor awakens at midnight and gets up to give his neighbor 3 loaves of bread, how much more will God the Father answer the prayer of his child who comes to him in need? Amen. Clearly, the parable does not teach that, like the neighbor, God does not wish to be disturbed. Rather, it's a contrast. It conveys the idea that the host continue to ask that the door be opened, and therefore the Christian must continue diligently in prayer with persistence. So now let's come back to Luke chapter 18. We've come all this long way to say that Luke has already covered this concept of being persistent in prayer. So why would he take the time to add this parable of the persistent woman and the unjust judge to his gospel? We've already covered this territory, Luke. Why now? Here again, Luke argues that if a surly, unrighteous judge will finally relent and hear the plea of a poor widow who just bugs him to death, how much more will a righteous and good-hearted God hear the prayers of those who pray to him without losing heart? And here he brings the point of persistence through with a rhetorical question. Will God not vindicate the elect who cry to him day and night? And we answer, of course he will. The judge listened to the widow for the wrong reason. He just wanted to get her off his back. He didn't want to be assaulted in the marketplace. God listens to his people because he loves them and vindicates their cause. He may keep his people waiting. He may exercise their patience. He may strengthen their faith. But at the proper time, God will answer the prayers of his people. The similarity between the persistent host who called his neighbor out of bed and the widow who kept coming back to the judge is clear. Both hoped that if they kept asking, they would see their request granted. And both had nowhere else to go. They had to be persistent. So it says it right there in the text. This was Jesus' purpose for telling these parables. But it was not necessarily Luke's reason for including them in his gospel. What gives, Luke? Why was it so important for you to let your church overhear these two stories that Jesus told his disciples? These parables, one about a man and another about a woman who didn't give up, who didn't lose heart, who didn't quit even in hostile circumstances. Without question, I think we can safely say that Luke, like Jesus, is letting his church, that church that's struggling not to lose heart in the face of delay and persecution and unanswered prayers, he's letting them overhear this parable to encourage them to be persistent, as Jesus had said. But I think there's something else to see here. I think that it's the hook that Luke attaches to the end of the parable. Many scholars believe that this last phrase was an addition several hundred years later, and perhaps not something that Jesus said, but something rather that Luke wrote in his gospel. And it's this hook. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith like this? When he comes, will he find faith like this? For Luke, the question is not about the character of God. Sometimes we read these parables and we're looking at that judge, and we're looking at that neighbor, and we're likening them to God. It's not a question about the character of God. Will God hear us? Will he answer us? Will he vindicate us? Of course he will. The question is, will we keep praying, even when it seems hopeless to do so? Will he find faith on earth? Will he find faith like this? Faith like what? Like a widow? Like that of this little widow who hurled petitions day and night at a wall of tough and hard and impenetrable silence, and then came back the next day to do it again and again and again? How long do you pray before you give in to sanity and cut your losses? How long before you move on? This is Luke's question. An elderly African-American minister who knew something of locked doors read this parable and gave a one-sentence interpretation. Until you stood for years knocking at a locked door with bloody knuckles, you don't really know how to pray. Do bloody knuckles fit into your image of prayer? Do you have room in your theology of prayer for that? If you don't, you may want to consider including it. You might want to learn to pray like that, because to live very long in this world is to sometimes experience the frustration of delay, the pain of injustice, and the silence of questions put to God with no answers in sight. And the despair and the loss of heart that threaten Luke's church threatens you and I, because despair is a seductive suitor. It's hard to pray and not lose heart when in every turn someone is saying to you, would you like to come over for a nice warm cup of despair? We better listen to Luke. This is no cozy, sentimental theology of prayer. There's no list of answered prayer, no guaranteed results in these parables. I heard another pastor friend tell once about being invited to a prayer meeting at someone's house for what they call some in-depth prayer. Actually, there was a little praying going on, the minister said. What was going on was someone was sitting at a table with a laptop tallying answers to prayer. Since they'd been keeping score, my friend said, they'd recorded over 1,500 answers to prayer in that group, proving beyond a doubt that God answers prayers. The thing is, they recorded all sorts of things that they said were specific answers to prayer. There was a diamond ring that somebody prayed for, a trip to Europe, a date with somebody named Mike. The list went on and on. Finally, when the minister could take it no more, he said, "You know, folks, I have to confess I'm a little uneasy about this view of prayer. Rings and trips and dates with Mike and such. As though God were some kind of cosmic slot machine." The group took offense. They were outraged. They said to him, "Well, the Bible says whatever you ask, he'll give it to you." And that's true. We just read it. Maybe you have maintained a spreadsheet of answered prayer. Maybe you have the whole collection of Roger Monroe's incredible answers to prayer. And if you do, I want you to know that's okay. That's an aspect of prayer. God answers our prayers. And to be mindful and remind ourselves of that can be important. But you must know that that's only part of the equation. You see, the Bible also says that prayer is sometimes like a widow who stands at a locked door with bloody knuckles crying, "Grant me justice. Vindicate me." No rabbit out of the hat, just long, windy silence. And honest people know that that's also true. Jesus did. He knew it. Luke says that he prayed all night on more than one occasion. Some ancient texts say that it was praying on the night of his arrest, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling on the ground. Do you see it? Once upon a time, the greatest prayer of all time prayed. He prayed 3 times for God to do something, and all he heard was windy silence. After Gethsemane, the notion that prayer is just some sort of cosmic slot machine can be forever dismissed. You see, sometimes you pray for that job, and you get it, and you can put it on your spreadsheet. But sometimes you send off that resume, and you don't even get a response. You don't even know if they got it. Sometimes you pray for that date with Mike, and he accepts, or he asks you out, and you write that on your list. But then a couple of weeks later, you find out that he's abusive. Sometimes you lose your keys, and you find them and put that on your spreadsheet. And sometimes the keys are right there hanging in that red car. And so Luke asked his church, and he asked ours, knowing this about prayer, when the Son of Man comes back, will he find any faith? And it's a good question. For faith, if it's really faith, lives within limits. It embraces mystery. It settles down with silence. It knocks until its knuckles bleeds. And then it trusts that on the other side of that door, there is someone who knows his name. All we know about a life of prayer is asking and seeking and knocking and waiting and trusting, sometimes angry, sometimes frustrated, but always finding a way to live within the limits. Sometimes all we have to go on in our faith is that God is not an unjust judge. Sometimes all we can do when we can't understand, when we can't see his plan, when we can't trace his hand, is to persistently trust his heart and continue to pray. When the Son of Man returns, will he find faith with blood on his knuckles? Yes, these two parables challenge us to be persistent in prayer. And yes, they teach us that God ultimately will not neglect the prayers of his people, and he will answer them in his perfect time. But they also serve as a warning to us. A warning that says we must be careful not to let the delays and the temptations and the trials of life discourage us to the point that we fail to persist and persevere in prayer. Our persistence is not to woo or influence God. It's for us. Our discipline and commitment to persistence may be the very thing that preserves our side of the relationship with the Father. When the Son of Man returns, will he find faith with blood on his knuckles? As the days and weeks turned into months, I would periodically visit Miss Elsie as she received her treatments. Often I would find her in the bedside chair beside the hospital bed there, quietly rubbing her stomach. Sometimes I would sit with her for a while in that silence. Sometimes I would pray for her. That's what she said I could do. But I often ran out of prayer before I ran out of concern and hurt for her. She sat there rubbing her stomach, and we would sit in silence. Finally, one day, Miss Elsie spoke. She spoke not of her cancer, but of loneliness and grief. Carefully touching the subject with infinite reverence, she said that her grief was a stone in the womb. Like a stone, I said? She said, no, not like a stone in my womb. A physical, painful, heavy presence. And you pray it will go away, she said, but it doesn't go. You plead to Jesus because you feel that you just can't bear the suffering, but you bear it anyway because it doesn't go. She sat there and rubbed her stomach. The sound of that hospital gown. Finally, you understand, she said, that this is the way it's going to be forever until you die. That stone is not going to pass. You're going to mourn forever, but you say that this isn't necessarily wrong. Finally, you say it's right and it's good. The sorrow that started as an enemy ends as a friend. Over the next several visits, Miss Elsie explained to me how her sorrow had become now a familiar thing, and the perpetual pain in her stomach a needful thing. It was there when she woke in the middle of the night. It was there in the morning. She took it to church with her, and she brought it home. This baby would never be born and never leave, but would be her companion forever. It was the loneliness that kept a widow from being altogether lonely, because inside of her, it was a fetal memory, if you will, of her husband. A pain that wanted rubbing. A sorrow that caused her to sigh. But it was also the love of her husband, a sacred trust that she was not willing to relinquish, even if it never subsided. I would often leave Miss Elsie's company with a mix of emotions. Often sad for her, but never hopelessly so. Because I had come to understand that she was a woman who knew how to pray, and a woman who had come to know ways in which to live with the limits. And she was a woman who knew what it meant to knock at the door with bloody knuckles if need be, with a determination and a conviction that on the other side there was somebody who knew her name.